Hi everyone, Ann here, the master of first times, the chick you want to keep up with, and the voice you want in your head, because I am the voice that tells you you can. Welcome to a new interview series that is part of the Maximize Your Life Summit series, where I am bringing you some incredible experts, authors, professionals, and speakers to dig deeper into the benefits of first times and new experiences. Let's go ahead and meet our guests. Joining me today is Ryan Rydzewski, the co-author of When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, Caring Kids. He's here to dig deeper and teach us more about two benefits of first times and new experiences, curiosity and creativity. Ryan, I am wearing my t-shirt. The future belongs to creativity for you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I love that shirt.
All right, so let's get into this. I love it. Thank you for sending me that early copy of the book. Absolutely love reading it. I'm very excited to dig into it. So tell me, what inspired you and your co-author, Craig, to write When You Wonder, You're Learning?
Well, that's a good question. And I would say two things. The first is, Gregg and I both grew up watching Mr. Rogers. We're both children of Western Pennsylvania, where Mr. Rogers is from. And I think for us, as for a lot of adults, he evokes a sort of, we just have a strong emotional connection to him. When adults see Mr. Rogers now, I think they think about, the feeling he gave us, which was warmth and safety and trust. And we just felt good to be in Fred Rogers' presence. I think the second reason, though, is that we wanted to peel back the layers on Mr. Rogers and his program a little bit to see what it was that made Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood so effective in the first place. We've had such a Mr. Rogers renaissance recently with a best-selling biography, Morgan Neville's beautiful documentary. We just had a motion picture with Tom Hanks. The question we had was, what is it that keeps us coming back to Mr. Rogers, and what can we learn from him today? How can adults replicate what he was doing here in the digital age?
I love it. Okay, so confession time. I have never watched an episode of Mr. Rogers. So I grew up in Canada, and I meant curiosity. I meant to Google this, see if the show was translated in French, but I don't think it was. So I grew up in Canada, so I didn't get the opportunity of hearing and learning from Mr. Rogers. So reading the book was so fascinating to me because I have never seen it, but the way that you guys uncovered Mr. Rogers' approach. So how was that like, discovering just how methodical he was and the level of research that he did for the show?
Yeah, it was interesting so Mr. Rogers, who did have a brief venture up to Canada before he became the Mr. Rogers we all know, but he was a scientist at heart. We don't necessarily think of Mr. Rogers as a scientist, but before he ever went on television, he studied with some of the top minds in child psychology and education in the world, who all happened to be in Pittsburgh at the same time. So this was Dr. Benjamin Spock, who wrote one of the best-selling books on childcare of all time. It's a bestseller even today. This was Fred's mentor, Margaret McFarland. And he had a whole team around him of child development experts, of psychologists, of teachers, of counselors. And he took what he learned from them and designed sort of a blueprint for learning, from which he built Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So our job in writing this book was to sort of make that blueprint for learning visible to today's readers, and also give them some examples of how today's educators, child psychologists, counselors, and others are doing some of the same things that Mr. Rogers was doing on his program, but in some very different contexts.
I love it. Yeah. And, reading the book and peeling those layers,
to me, it was just like, we have the answers. Why can we not properly implement all of this? Because it seemed like it did, like it was meant to be, that all these people found themselves at the same place at the same time with the same purpose, the same love and vision and care for, raising that generation's children, which is the adult of today.
Sure.
And oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I agree. I mean, it was sort of serendipitous that so many people happened to be there, and that Fred Rogers had the skill sets and the creativity to put all this scientific knowledge together in a way that was attractive to kids, and that remains attractive even today.
Yeah.
So much of what he learned, so many of the scientific principles behind his program are so skillfully woven into his songs and his scripts and his sets, his physical sets, that it's hard to see them. It's hard to even know that they're
To
there.
realize that, and that's one thing I'm sure when people read the book and listen to this, they might not realize that it was very methodical. It was thought out. It was purposeful. So
There
let's
was an
start.
intention behind everything. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start digging a little bit into that then. So let's get into the topic first of curiosity.
Sure.
So one of the first takeaways on curiosity that might surprise people is that Mr. Rogers did not expect children to be curious about something they knew nothing about. So tell us a little bit more about why there needs to be some familiarity first, and what else is required to plant that seed of curiosity.
Sure. So there are some really interesting scientific studies about curiosity in kids, and almost all of them come back to the same principle, which is that kids will ask questions about things that are around them already, that they're already familiar with in their environment. They're actually much more likely to be curious about things that they have some familiarity with, but which spark questions in them. Whereas if you put an object in front of them that they know absolutely nothing about, or a topic in front of them that they know absolutely nothing about, that sort of intrinsic curiosity might not be there. So that's one reason why Rogers spent so much time in the neighborhood showing viewers, everyday objects, playing with things like blocks, or building sandcastles, or cutting things out with construction paper, things that almost all children can have access to, because he knew that's what sparks those intrinsic, self-motivated questions that encourage children to follow whatever it is that makes them curious.
All right, excellent. So that familiarity to raise a little bit of mystery and get that curiosity going. Now, another factor that you guys mentioned that Mr. Rogers ensured that he covered is safety. So there's a few kids, I have to say, like, I have always been a leap first ever since I was young, and I that has never changed. I think, some people think that children are just naturally adventurous and naturally curious, but that's not necessarily true. So tell us a little bit more about what Mr. Rogers knew and ensured he included in what he did.
Sure. Rogers knew that children learn best when they feel a sense of safety. And that, for kids, that often means that they know that there is a caring adult around, somebody who's there to protect them, someone who's there to guide them, not necessarily there to tell them what to do, but just to make sure that they're supported in whatever it is they themselves decide to do. He knew that when children feel threatened, whether physically or psychologically, some of the body's stress responses kick in. So things that are normally devoted to our cognition, resources that help us do our complex thinking, resources that help us engage our curiosity, our creativity. When children feel threatened, those resources are diverted to the body. They get children ready to fight or to flee or to freeze. Rogers knew that kids, in order to learn, really had to be able to relax. They had to feel a sense of supportive structure around them. That's why, from 1968 to 2001, his programs always began and ended the same way. He came through the door, he talked to us for a little bit, we would go off to the neighborhood of make-believe, and then we would come back to Mr. Rogers to talk about what we learned. He did that the same way for more than 30 years. And he knew it's because that when kids have a sense of familiarity, when kids have a routine, when they know what to expect, then they can relax enough to be able to learn.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I love it. And it's true for kids and it's true for adults. A solid foundation is required to build anything upon. So if you're stressed, you're worried, you're threatened in any kind of way, then you shut down. You can't thrive that way. So you have to manage all of those other emotions and things in your environment in order to go ahead and be able to step out into the unknown, outside your comfort zone, and get curious about everything that life has to offer.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's something to be said for the nervous excitement of trying something for the first time, right? But I think when we talk about safety, we're talking about not feeling threatened, not feeling judged. I think it's good to try something for the first time that scares you a little bit. But if you are worried about being rejected by your peers or failing in front of other people, I feel like you're probably not going to learn as much as you would if you were feeling safe and that you trust the people around you.
So it might be, developing more of your confidence, developing more of your awareness, developing other things before you start taking those big leaps. And I have to say, I've done paragliding, I've gone skydiving, I've done all those things.
Hard to feel safe when you're jumping out of an airplane.
Well, but still, I'm making sure, when I walk in an environment, I'm still making sure how things are run, how things are organized, how people, are they putting safety first? Are they doing, certain things that are gonna, okay, I'm doing a high risk activity, but everything surrounding it is, has safety put in place. That's a quick story. I was in Belize, and we went out on a sailboat to go not scuba diving, but snorkeling. And we have all the equipment on and we're about to go in the water. And one of the guys asked, is there anybody here who doesn't know how to swim? I was like, that's the kind of question you should have asked before you got in the sailboat, not right about when you're about to get in the water. So that was an interesting, thankfully I do know how to swim. Is anybody going to raise their hands that they think they're going to go snorkeling, but they don't know how to swim? All right. So
Fred always called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood a television visit. He didn't like to call it a show. If he had to, he would call it a television program. But he referred to it as a visit because he wanted to think about, what are the things that make a visitor feel safe when they come into your home, whether that's your TV living room or your actual home or an airplane that you're about to jump out of. He knew that a lot of that had to do with how things are set up. So like when you said you're looking around to make sure they're following safety protocols, Rogers never changed anything on his set without explaining to kids what was going to happen, why he was doing it, and what they might be able to expect. So on the rare occasions that his set did change, when he first began, his television program was in black and white. Then it became in color and his walls were beige. Eventually he painted them blue, and he spent a whole episode telling children, I'm going to paint my walls blue. This is what paint looks like. This is how it goes on the wall. Those physical surroundings, those signals of safety that you mentioned looking for on the airplane were really important to him. And so when he was whenever he considered altering the environment that he built so carefully, he always made sure that viewers knew what he was doing and why, and what they can expect from it.
Yeah, and it provides so much more processing where, explaining things develops your decision-making process, and it raises your self-awareness of your environment. Like, this is changing, this is why it's changing, this is why it is what it is. And it's so incredible. Like, I love the book because of how incredible it is to dissect everything that he's done and everything that you're talking about now, because it's so important to our development. And anybody who's listening, get the book and understand this and start applying it with your children and start applying it with yourself. Because unfortunately, if you don't grow up with that process being identified for yourself, then you might not have captured, you might not have those traits, you might not have those attributes, but it's never too late to develop them. So that transitions me to the next point of something that runs throughout the book, is that, if you are an adult if you're listening to this, you probably are. So it doesn't matter if you're a parent, educator, because you might be an aunt, you might be an uncle. There is a child or children that are within your reach. And so one of the things that is discussed is that if you don't possess those abilities as an adult, then you kind of run the risk of smothering or what's the word I'm looking for? Instead of nurturing the curiosity and the creativity in children, you might do the opposite. So can you talk to us about the bouncing raisin experiment and what was concluded from that experiment?
Absolutely. This is a really interesting experiment. And just to set a little context, so one of Fred Rogers' mentor, her name was Margaret McFarlane. She was a big believer in a Quaker saying that attitudes are caught, not taught, meaning that you can tell children all the things you want, but what they're mostly going to pay attention to are the things you do, the questions you ask, the energy and trust and safety that you bring to children's learning environments. So this was a sort of foundational principle of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. The bouncing raisins experiment is an interesting experiment that took place, I can't remember the exact year, but it was after Mr. Rogers' neighborhood had already been off the air. But what Susan Engel, who's a world famous child psychologist, and her graduate student did was bring children into a lab, and where they would do one of two things. With some children, they followed a science project called Bouncing Raisins, where the instructions told you to drop raisins into a certain kind of chemical solution and then describe what happened to the raisins. And for some kids, that's all they did. They just followed the directions and they put the raisins in, and that was it. For the other group, the researcher would say something like, I wonder what would happen if we put a Skittle in the solution instead of the raisin, so that the child would catch the researcher's curiosity and maybe start asking questions of his or her own. So you have one group that just followed directions. You had another group that watched the researcher sort of deviate a little bit and ask questions that motivated her. Then the researchers left the room and they watched what the kids would do when they were left on their own. Sure enough, the kids who'd watched the researchers just follow directions, putting raisins in and just stopping, didn't tend to do much. They just waited while the researcher was gone, and that was about it. The children who had been with the researchers who deviated a little bit started to get curious themselves. They started picking up things in the room and then putting them in the solution to see what would happen. They got curious. They had caught the researcher's curiosity. And once the researcher was gone, the child or the children in that group followed their own intrinsic curiosity wherever they wanted to go. So it was an interesting case study. And this happened again and again and again while we were reading the book. If you look at these modern experiments, if you read modern papers in the learning sciences, if you talk to some of the top education experts, what they tell you, you can always go back and see Mr. Rogers doing a version of it 50 years ago. He was decades ahead of his time. And when you realize the science behind the show and you can spot it, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood becomes a really helpful teaching tool.
Oh, absolutely. And it so many things in self-development, childhood development, any sort of development, its simplicity is always like mind-blowing, but yet the application, it's like where it's just go the step of the application. So if you are curious, you are going to pass that on to your child or really anybody that's around you. So that's the other thing about, again, I'll drive the point home about the book. It's not just for children. Literally the same things still apply as an adult. And it's one of the things, in the Marine Corps, I was having a conversation, this was quite a long time ago, but to some, older retired Marines, and they were talking about how now we're providing young Marines like lists for everything. And that is killing their ability to be creative, to be curious, to come up with their own solutions, to think through problems. So when you give everybody the answer, or you tell them this is the way to do it, this is the only way to do it, there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be people who are going to have the natural curiosity, but that's not the majority. So it's so important to keep the options open, and to be willing to make a fool of yourself, to be silly, to explore.
You are absolutely right. First of all, you're right. This book is not just about being with children. It's about how any human being can live his or her life. And I'm sorry that my co-author is not here, but we have learned through the process of writing this book the importance of what you just said. The example he often gives is, as we were writing the book, he was in his garage one day and saw his old skateboard, which is not something he had been on in decades. And he was naturally curious, like what would happen if I were to get on this skateboard after years and years and years, which I think is a normal adult experience. Like we all have things that we used to do as kids that we have set aside for whatever reason. And the further, the longer it's been, the more scary it becomes to try to pick up that skill or that curiosity. But to Gregg's credit, he got back on that skateboard. I think because we were so immersed in this kind of science and thinking about this kind of thing. And now his daughters are skateboarding. And now I think he said 6 or 7 kids on his block are all skateboarding. And it's amazing, again, that attitudes are caught, not taught. He didn't tell them to go skateboard, and he certainly didn't tell the other kids in the neighborhood that they should take up skateboarding. But I think when kids see adults indulging their curiosity and, indulging their childhood interests, whatever their passions were, it's not something that we often let ourselves do as adults, but it's really important and really powerful when kids see that.
Yeah, and it's so much fun. I mean, it's something that I love. Every time I found myself back around Marines, so one of the last big time, I'm a major at that time, and I love being around the Marines because they're 18, 19 years old, and most of them are boys, men, so they act like kids. And I love it because I love acting like a kid. I mean, I understand you wear a certain rank, have to be a certain way, but you know what? As long as they understood there's 2 sides. There's a side that can have a lot of, you can be foolish and childlike and doing silly things, and then you can have a very serious business, like it's not one or the other. You can inhabit, those different personalities, different traits. So that leads us to another study that's in the book that I love that you all included. And that's the 1968 study by Dr. George Land. I know when I first read about that study a few years ago, I was shocked. I was fascinated, and then I was so disappointed. I was like, oh my God. So can you tell us more about that study? Because it definitely ties into what we're talking about right now.
Sure. Yeah, this is a fascinating one. So in 1968, Dr. George Land got together a cohort of, I think it was 500 kids. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but
I think it was about 1,000. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What he did was administer a test of, these were 5-year-olds, administered a test of their curiosity. And this was the same sort of test that had been developed by NASA to help them find astronauts at the time. And what he found was, I think it was 98% of these 5-year-olds were so creative that they scored in the creative genius range of the test he was using, which is just an astounding number.
That's crazy. It's like,
and,
wow.
And anyone who's spent much time around a 5-year-old and just, you get them talking and you can understand, yes, they're very creative people and they can invent a story like that out of nothing. Dr. Land followed this cohort and retesting them, giving the same assessment every 5 years up through adulthood. And what he found is that every time he tested them 5 years later, there would be a huge drop in the percentage of kids and then adults who reached the sort of creative genius stage of the test. I think it went from 98% at age 5 to about 2%
Yeah, 2%
in
by
early
the time
adulthood.
they're adult. Yeah.
Yeah. And to Land's
And the
credit,
first 5 years had a massive drop. The first five
oh
years, I
yeah,
think almost
oh yeah,
30% drop,
from 5 to 10,
Yep.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and to Land's credit, it's easy to hear those numbers and despair, like, oh, well, creativity is something that just disappears when you get older. But he said something really interesting. He said non-creative behavior is something that we learn. In other words, creativity is the default. People, that's what people are born with. It doesn't naturally disappear. We learn to stop indulging it over the course of our lives. And I think that's why, to go back to Gregg's skateboard example, it can become scary, to go back to those, to allow ourselves space to go back to that childlike curiosity, that childlike sense of, I can ask any question I want, I can experiment with whatever I want, I can follow my passions to wherever they might lead me. Adults really don't allow themselves to do that. There's so much cultural pressure to do things that are, quote unquote, productive, things that make money. And there's a good reason for a lot of that. We all have to support our families. But I think it becomes the norm for a lot of adults to just set aside your old skateboard, to set aside your old guitar, to stop painting, to stop drawing, to stop dancing, singing, whatever it is that you used to like to do. I think our kids will benefit if we were to go ahead and pick that stuff back up. But not only our kids, like we ourselves will benefit. There's so much scientific data behind the benefits of creativity in adulthood now, from better emotional well-being to even better physical health.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest benefit of first time new experiences is it does fuel that creativity, and that's why my T-shirt. That's why I designed this T-shirt. The future belongs to creativity, because everything that you're productive doing right now won't be long that a machine is going to do it. A computer,
True.
a robot is going to do it, and what's left is what is humanly inherent to us, that we are born with, is creativity, the ability to see the world differently. And that's where the problem, solving the future's problem is going to be creativity. Everything about improving, the human race and our lives is tied to creativity. It's one of the most sought after skill now, and that's only going to increase in the future. And if you stay in your structured routine, habit, and grind, it doesn't come from that. You have to fuel it. And, the more, and that's the thing, curiosity leads to creativity, because curiosity leads you to want to learn and explore and discover. And as you do that, it fuels what you need for your brain to make connection and be creative about.
Absolutely. And I like what you said about, everything, all the most important things about our future as human beings, as individuals, as a society, as the human race, rely on creativity. You're right. And I think best of all, creativity it's what makes life worth living. I don't think if anybody looks back on their lives, I don't think anybody's going to say their best days were the days that they answered a lot of emails and got to a meeting on time and cashed a big, well, maybe depending on the size of the paycheck, that might be a good day. But I think when people look back on their lives, the moments that define them, the moments that give their life meaning, it's usually in relation to other people and in relation to a creative pursuit, whatever that pursuit might look like for each of us. It's always different.
So let's jump back into Mr. Rogers' world.
Sure.
And how did he teach the creative process?
Well, he began with that old saying, attitudes are caught, not taught. So you see him on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood engaged in any number of creative pursuits. So whether he's painting, whether he's learning a new language, whether he is showing viewers how puppets work. He himself was a very creative person. He studied music as an undergraduate. He wrote more than 200 songs, more than a dozen operas for the neighborhood. He's a very prolific artist himself. So I think the first way he taught creativity was just to model that in the neighborhood. The second way was he brought in all sorts of guests from every kind of discipline and introduced them to children. So whether that was Julia Child, cooking things in a kitchen, whether it was LeVar Burton from Reading Rainbow, talking to kids about books, or whether it was just the everyday characters who were part of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Every day, when children tuned in to watch that television program, they saw adults who were pursuing things that were meaningful to them. And they saw what those creative pursuits did for those adults. And they saw that lots of different people are creative in lots of different ways, and that they can do that too. Again, whatever that might mean to each specific child.
Yeah, so there's a lot of variety and creativity, but
right.
I like how you all also cover in the book that it takes a little bit of work and effort as well.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one because I think for kids and adults alike, if you just imagine sitting down to watch a movie, when we watch a 2-hour movie, we are watching the product of months and months and months of work condensed into that final product. And when kids aren't necessarily familiar with the process of a finished, what goes into a finished creative work, it can be easy to think that, somebody just decided to film a movie and they did it in an afternoon, or, that the first draft of a book is the finished product. What Rogers did in the neighborhood that I think was really valuable was he always showed viewers the work that goes into a creative pursuit. So whenever there was an opera, and there were many in the neighborhood, kids always saw the rehearsals. They always saw the writing. They always saw the sort of struggles and sometimes conflicts between people who are part of the production. And importantly, they also saw how those conflicts were resolved. They saw the whole process from messy beginning to finished end. And I think that let them know that, well, yes, creativity is playful and it's fun and it makes life worthwhile. It also involves some very real work, and you have to learn the basics. You have to try, you have to fail, you have to try, you have to fail again. I think it gives them license to not be perfect right away. And that is another kind of safety, I think, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, letting children know that they are enough as they are right now, and that learning is a lifelong journey. So you don't have to be perfect the first time. You don't have to be perfect the 50th time. What matters is that you're trying and you're doing something that's meaningful to you.
Oh, I love it. It's just, he was there's nothing that he left unturned, because inspiration, motivation, there's perspiration, that's part of it. And then it's a cycle. And the fact that he's teaching children, and again, adults, so many adults don't understand this, right? When creative juices are flowing, you are inspired, you're motivated, you're gun-ho. Well, they're not going to last. And now with neuroscience, we know how that's tied to the neurotransmitter. The brain chemicals are released in our brains. So the things that are required in order to release more of those chemicals or to get into the flow. So it makes what you're trying to do easier, and you can be more focused. But that neuroplasticity, another t-shirt I have is I do neuroplasticity, doesn't happen unless you get to that point of almost frustration with what you're doing, to where your brain has to rewire itself, because there's the good stress, there's a little bit of pressure, there's an application of frustration that
Absolutely.
creates that change. And while the science back then during Mr. Rogers' time was not what it is today, he still completely understood that. Now we have even more information, more data, and it's like, what are we doing with it?
I agree. I mean, digging into the brilliance of Fred Rogers, it's the more you dig, the more you find. And that's why writing this book has been a privilege of a lifetime. I think it has changed Gregg and I as human beings, being so exposed and so immersed in what it was he was doing.
So that was going to be my final question is
Oh, sure.
how has it changed you? Like what does it look like for you now moving forward that you do have all of this information and knowledge, for your life? Obviously, teaching it to others
Sure.
is key and a tremendous aspect of elevating that conversation, that content, and engaging more people into learning and applying. But how are you applying everything in your
Yeah,
life?
that's a great question. And I would say two things. The first is that, so Mr. Rogers in our culture is sort of held up as this, almost saintly figure of unconditional kindness and warmth and love. And absolutely, like he set the bar so high for, how we treat each other, how we interact with the world. I think one of the big lessons that we took away from writing this book is that, like, yes, Mr. Rogers is someone that we all can and ought to look up to. But he got that way because he had a method. Because he worked really hard at it, because he studied with the best, and because he, got up every morning and tried to apply these lessons to his own life. All of us can do a version of what Mr. Rogers did. All of us can be like Fred. We can be like Fred for each other. We can be like Fred for our children. We can be like Fred for ourselves. And I would say the second piece is, like, as adults, we just need to give ourselves permission to play, to be curious about the things that authentically interest us, to pursue whatever it is that we feel gives our lives meaning and makes us happy and makes us able to be more present in the world, whether that's, again, for each other or for children. We just need to allow ourselves, the permission to be a little bit more like Fred. And it's not always going to be easy. Fred would be the first one to say that. A quote he often said was, try your best to make goodness attractive. That's the toughest assignment you'll ever be given. I think we need to give ourselves permission to accept that assignment and to know that we're going to fail sometimes. But then the next day we're going to get up and we're going to try again, and we're going to be a little bit better. And I think if we can allow ourselves to get a little bit better every day, and to know that we, like our children, are lifelong learners, we're going to set a really great example for kids and for each other.
Absolutely. All right. So as everyone, so it's just so you know, because we talked about the concept of curiosity and creativity, but the book covers a lot more. So it gets into communication, working together, learning and growing, and connection. So definitely you all need to get the book to further explore those other areas. So Ryan, how do people get the book, get in touch with you and Gregg?
Sure. They can go to whenyouwonder.org. There's some more information about the book there. There are some links to pre-order. The book comes out on April 20th, but it's available for pre-order now, and there are some pre-order incentives. So if people submit their receipt, they can get the first chapter and a couple of other things delivered to their inbox. But yeah, we're very excited about it. At the very least, I hope the book helps the world understand that the most important thing is to know that we are both loved and capable of loving. That was Fred's message. And all those things that we talk about in the book, creativity, curiosity, communication, are all conduits for that really essential goal of knowing that we're loved and capable of loving.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I have to say another thing as I was reading the book, because again, I had never been exposed to Mr. Rogers. So I'm reading the book and I'm thinking about the 365 First Challenge, first time storytelling, because I discovered it's great to be, obviously the exposure first time when you experience is so incredible because of all the benefits.
Sure.
But then you need, a great thing is you need to be able to communicate with, or, be able to tell stories, because that's so important to our well-being, to be able to communicate who we are and love how you thoroughly covered how important it is to be heard. I think, there's a responsibility on yourself to communicate in a way that makes it easier for people to hear you and to listen and to, build that rapport and the relationship. And, and this is what this summit is about. It's about exposing you all to the possibilities and what it takes to have a very full, maximize, amazing life. And all of this comes from my personal experience. Like it's all things that I learned and experienced that now, I'm teaching. I want to bring some, the expert to, reaffirm what, how amazing, incredible life can be for you. And then you reach that out to the community, and Mr. Rogers definitely got that done. And you all captured that so beautifully in your book. So go out, pre-order the book, and get in touch with Ryan. Provide them some reviews, some feedback. And I'm sure there's some much greater projects, no doubt, that are in your future. Thank you so much for being a guest and sharing all this great information with us.
Thank you so much, and it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm super excited about the summit, and I can't wait to follow what you do next as well.
Great.